some spooky stories. Excellent. Welcome. Thank you for staying for late night at the Storytelling Festival. What passes for late night? A lot of us. My name is Amanda Lawrence. I'm your MC. I'm also one of your storytellers. I live just up the road in Blairsville. I'm local. Your other storyteller tonight is the tremendously talented Andy Russell. And Andy has come all the way from Florida just to scare you. We're going to tell 2 stories each and take turns. But as we get started, I want us to take a moment and use our imaginations. Because we're not sitting outside the campfire. We're in this room at the resort. So here's what I want us to do. Everybody close your eyes. And imagine yourself sitting by a campfire. The world is so still, you can hear the crackle of every flame. Picture the orange embers floating upward to the stars. And the wisps of smoke making their way to the beyond. Gather round the flickering flames, where shadows dance but have no names. In the heart of the mountains, whispers wail, as we begin our ghostly tale. Please welcome Andy.
I'm going to start us off one that is more fun than scary, but at the time I thought it was pretty scary. It's Halloween. I'm in the 2nd grade and I'm excited. Now, just being Halloween is enough to make me excited, but I was especially excited this year because my parents were going to let my brother and me go trick-or-treating all by ourselves. My brother Doug was in the 5th grade, and his best friend Mike was going with us, but my parents were going to stay home the whole time. They gave us 3 rules. We had to stay together. My brother had the flashlight. We could only trick-or-treat in our neighborhood, just around that one block. And we couldn't eat any of our candy until after we got home. Well, I knew my brother did not want me to go along. I knew this because I was standing beside him when he told my mother he did not want me to go along. And she said, "And why not?" And Doug says, "'Cause he's little and he'll slow us down. And besides," he said, looking right at me, "he's a baby. Am not R2, am not stopping." My mother had a way of stopping arguments. Now, you 2 boys can find a way to go trick-or-treating together, or you can both stay home. You let me know what you'd like to do. Well, my brother made a huffing sound. He got down, and as he walked past me, he punched me on the arm, and he said, "Stupid." Well, I was still excited because I was going as Casper the Friendly Ghost. If you don't know Casper was a cartoon ghost when I was a little boy. And he lived with 3 grown-up ghosts who were always grumpy and trying to scare people. But not Casper. Casper was a friendly ghost. And I thought, I'm going to be a ghost. I want to be a friendly one. Well, my brother was going as a flying monkey. Remember, in The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West had those monkeys with those wings and they'd flap and scoop people up? Yeah, that's what he was. And his costume looked pretty good, except the wings. When he first had it on, one wing was up and the other one was down. And the next time he tried it, this wing was up and that one was down. And right before we went out trick-or-treating, both wings were down. If you looked at him from the front, he just looked like a regular monkey with a funny hat. Now, I tried to lift him up for him, but my brother just pushed me away, and that was the end of it. Well, we started off. Mike joined us right away, and we went to the very first house. My brother pushed up, and he rang the doorbell. Ding dong! And this lady came to the door. And she looked at us, and she got right down in my face and said, "Aren't you the scariest little ghost ever?" And I ripped off my mask and said, "No, I'm a friendly ghost." And my brother said, "Put your mask back on, stupid." And then the lady left, and a man came, and he looked right at Doug, and he said, "What's the matter? Lost your organ grinder already?" Now, I wasn't exactly sure what an organ grinder was, so I asked my brother as we were walking away, and he said, "Shut up." Well, we heard some other monkey jokes that night. Usually there was somebody just looking right at my brother and saying, "Oh, just out monkeying around, are you?" There were 2 houses where they gave Mike and me big chocolate floors. They gave Doug a banana. Well, Doug was getting mad. I knew he was because he's walking faster and faster, and Mike could trot and keep up with him, but I couldn't, and I was having trouble, and they turned the corner ahead of me, and when I got up there, I tripped and I dropped my bag, and my candy went all over, and I'm hollering for them, but they kept going, but I'm like, okay, they'll wait for me when they make that next turn. Not only did they not wait for me, they didn't make the turn. They kept on going. So I'm hurrying and I'm hollering, and finally at the next block, then they stopped and they turned around, Doug shining the flashlight. Well, when I caught up to him, I said, "We were supposed to turn right back there." Doug said, "Shut up. You see that house across the street?" I looked at it, looked like all the other houses. He said, "There's a wicked witch that lives there. And her favorite thing to eat is little boys. Sometimes she'll bite off their heads in one bite, but usually she'll just take a finger or a toe, because that way they last longer." Well, I was kind of thinking maybe we ought to skip that house. But my brother's pushing me forward, and the next thing I know, he's pushing me up on the porch and telling me to ring the doorbell. So I reached up, ding dong, and right then I hear my brother's voice behind me, "Run!" And I turned around just in time to see my brother and Mike disappear in the darkness running up the street. And behind me, I heard that door creak open. And I turned around, and there was the witch. And she had a tall black hat and green skin and a really long nose. And she was holding something on a platter, and she said, "Care for an apple? They might be poisoned, you know." Well, this next part I only know because my brother told me later. Well, we'll catch up in just a second. Doug and Mike ran up that next block. Finally, they stopped, partly to get their breath and partly to stop laughing. And they started walking back down, and Doug said, "I bet Andy will be waiting for us at the corner of that yard where we left him." When they got there, I wasn't there. And then Mike said, "Do you think he tried to walk home without us?" Doug said, "Nah, even he's not that stupid." And then Mike said, "Do you think the witch got him?" Doug didn't have an answer for that, but he started walking down toward the house. And Mike's trotting along. He says, "Are you going to ring the doorbell?" "No, because then she'd know we were here." So they got down below the porch, and Mike got up on Doug's shoulder so he could see in the window. And Doug says, "Can you see the witch?" "No." "Can you see Andy?" "Yeah." "And he's still got his head." "I can't see his fingers and toes. But he's turning up. He's eating ice cream." Right then, a big man's voice came out of the darkness. "What are you boys doing here?" And both of them fell to the ground. As they're scrambling to get up, the man steps out, and it's our daddy. Right then, that front door creaks open, and that witch steps out, and she says, "Won't you come in, boys? We've been expecting you." Well, here's what happened to me. I'm on that front porch with that witch, and I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do, but the one thing I wasn't going to do was eat one of those apples. But I'm sitting there, and I felt my lower lip start to quiver, but I wasn't going to cry, and what I said was, "I hate Halloween." And when I said that, that witch took a step back, and she said, "And why is that?" And I said, it's not supposed to be this way. And I ripped off my mask, because I'm a friendly ghost. And that witch got down on one knee and she said, I'm a friendly witch. And she reached down inside her dress and she wiggled around in there, and you won't believe it, she ripped off her whole face. Off came that black hat, off came all that green skin, off came that big long nose, and underneath was Mrs. Whiteside, my Sunday school teacher. And I love Mrs. Whiteside. She gave me a hug right there on the porch, and she says, well, you're a long way from home. Are you all by yourself? And I told her about Doug and Mike running off. And she said, well, I have an idea. How about you come in with me? I will fix you a big bowl of ice cream, and I'll call your mother, and she will come pick you up. I thought this was a great idea. And she did fix me a big bowl of ice cream with pieces of chopped up bats and chopped up rats. They tasted like chocolate. And she called my mother. My mother told my daddy. My daddy came to pick us up. Well, the ride home was pretty quiet. We let Mike off at his house, and then when we got to our house, we all went in and sat around the dining room table where my mother was waiting. And we had a long talk about where we had been and why we had been there. And then my mother told me to dump out everything in my bag on the table. And she rummaged through it and she said, you can pick out 2 pieces of candy for tonight, and we'll save the rest for later. I got the Reese's peanut butter cups, because they're my favorites. Well, then she told Doug to dump his bag out, and she rummaged through it, and she put all it back in the bag. She put his bag up in the freezer, and she said, we'll talk about what happens to your candy tomorrow, but you can have all the bananas you want. Well, we went on up to bed, and as soon as things got quieted down, I said, hey, Doug, what? And I got up and I tipped her over, and I said, hold out your hand. And when he did, I gave him one of my Reese's peanut butter cups. And I got back in the bed. And in a little bit, Doug says, hey, Andy, yeah, I'm sorry I left you at the witch's house. And I said, I know. And in a little bit, I said, hey, Doug, yeah, next year, can we go to Mrs. Whiteside's house first? You bet. Happy Halloween.
Did that bring back a lot of memories for you? Yeah. I hope my story doesn't. Yes.
I'm in 2nd grade.
You're in 2nd grade. Are you having a good time? Yeah. Awesome. Do you have your own stories you like to tell?
No.
I bet you will. I'm going to tell one that comes from North Carolina. Holly was the sweetest, prettiest girl in Goldsboro, North Carolina. So all the local boys wanted to date her. And consequently, all the local girls wanted to hate her. But they couldn't because she was just so nice. So while the local boys tripped all over themselves trying to get Polly's attention, the local girls jealously bided their time, waiting for Polly to hurry up and choose her man, so that the rest of the fellas, the ones she didn't pick, would be back in circulation. But Polly took her time. She'd sit with this fella or that one at the church social. Nobody particularly caught her eye until George Dean came back to town. George had been off at the university finishing his law degree. Came home, took a job in his father's firm. He was tall, handsome, and slick. Polly took one look at him and determined he was going to be her man. But the course of true love never did run smooth. Because you see, while Polly had her sights firmly set on George, he didn't seem to notice her at all. So she took what were for her extreme measures. She dropped her library books in front of him on the sidewalk in town one day. He just stepped around them, and she said, So she baked him a batch of her famous honey cookies and delivered them to the law firm. Do you know he didn't even return the container, much less write a thank you note? She said, But Polly was relentless. She tried anything and everything to get him to notice her. Nothing seemed to work. Well, the truth is, George had noticed Polly. I mean, right away, in fact, she was the prettiest girl in Goldsboro. But he'd also noticed all those other fellows tripping all over themselves to get her attention. And he had decided the best way to pique her interest would be to play hard to get. Well, it nearly backfired. By the time George finally came to call on Polly, she was in such a tizzy, she almost told him no when he invited her to the Saturday evening dance. But then she thought better of it because she knew they were meant to be. So she said yes, and from that moment, they were a couple. They went everywhere together. Saturday evening dances, they sat in the same pew Sunday morning. Nobody was surprised when within a month, George asked Polly to marry him, and she said yes. Well, pretty soon, Polly got swept up in the wedding plans. She had to find the right dress and the cake and the shoes, the flowers, and on and on. But George had no interest in such things. So he left her to get along with it, and he started spending time down at the pool hall. That's where he met Helene, the owner's daughter. If Polly was sugar and spice, Helene was bar smoke and whiskey. He took one look at her red lipstick and was enthralled. Well, Polly was so busy with the wedding plans, it just took her a while to notice George wasn't around as much as he had been. But she was finally helped to that realization by one of those local girls who'd been so jealous and was only too happy to share all the gossip about George and the pool hall and Helene. Polly said, this will never do. And she marched straight down to the pool hall and she confronted Helene. She said, you back off. George is my man and I will have him. And then to seal the deal, she called together her parents and George's, and they all sat George down for a talking to. And if you grew up in the South, you know what that looks like. George was to straighten up and fly right. No more pool hall, no more Helene. And in that way, Goldsboro's loveliest young couple was once again on their way to the altar. Well, the day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Polly and her bridesmaids were in the back room at the church, getting dressed, giggling. And Polly was a vision. Long, flowing dress, crisp lace at the wrists and the neck, soft veil covering her shining face. And the church was overflowing. Everyone in town had come to see the wedding. Everyone, that is, except George. Where was he? George's father thought maybe he was still at home and went there to check. He wasn't there. And then George's older brother thought maybe there'd been an accident. He was at the hospital. He wasn't there. Finally, George's younger brother thought to check the pool hall. Well, George wasn't there either, but Helene's younger sister was, and she reported that George and Helene had eloped about an hour before George was supposed to marry Polly. Well, back at the church, it fell to Polly's mother to deliver the news. She looked at her daughter standing there at the altar, so lovely in her wedding dress, waiting for George so patiently, and her heart broke. But the tale had to be told. When Polly learned that George and Helene had run off together, she said, no, it can't be. George is my man. And then she swayed as a sharp pain shot up her left arm. She had a massive heart attack and died before she even hit the floor. And that was how Polly's wedding became Polly's wake. Oh, talk about brokenhearted. Right? Polly's parents were deeply grieved, deeply angry too. They blamed George for their daughter's death. And so did his parents, and on top of that, George's parents were just plain embarrassed because the whole town was talking about how their son had caused the death of this beautiful young girl. You know how people are. People were saying, if he was going to break up with her, he should have had the decency to do it in person instead of leaving her standing there in wedding dress in front of the whole town. Well, the whole town came to Polly's funeral. Everyone weeping. She was buried under a spreading oak tree in the churchyard, just steps from where she was to have been married. And wouldn't you know it, George and Helene got back from their honeymoon just as the mourners were filing out of the church. Polly's father attacked George, and he might have killed him if the preacher hadn't pulled him off. And then George's father, he hurt George even worse. He fired him from the law firm for unethical conduct, and and disowned him right there in front of God and everybody. So George and Helene left town in disgrace to start their new life elsewhere. And back in Goldsboro, the scandal died down, got replaced by the next dust-up, as often happens. Until a year later, when George's father died. And he was buried in that same churchyard, just a few plots over from home. Well, that stirred up all the old gossip. And then the talk turned to whether George would come home for the funeral, and if he did, whether he'd be welcome. Well, he did come home, but he didn't go to the funeral. He had some things he wanted to say to his father in private. So late that night, George went to the churchyard alone. He stood over his father's grave, venting his frustrations. After his father had fired him, he hadn't been able to get a job at another law firm. He'd had to pick up work as a farmhand of all things. And the hours were so long that Helene had begun stepping out with other men. His life was a mess, and it was all his father's fault for turning him out just because that goody two-shoes Polly had the bad luck to die. Well, he was going to get it all back because he knew where his father kept his money. As George stood there plotting his revenge and return to wealth and social prominence, he heard a soft voice call his name. George? George. At first he thought it was his mother come to comfort him, but no, the voice was much too high. His mother was a contralto in the church choir. Then he heard it again. Oh, George, I knew you'd come. He turned toward the sound and he saw her rising up from the grassy mound under the spreading oak tree. Long flowing dress, wilted lace at the wrists and the neck, tattered veil covering her rotting face. It was Polly. Every hair on George's neck stood up. He put one hand to his chest and staggered back, the other arm outstretched to try to ward off the spectral bride floating toward him. Polly swooped in and grabbed his arm. Her grip was so cold it burned, and so strong he could hear the crunch of his bones as she squeezed. She said, "Come along, George," and pulled him toward the church. George's arm was a red agony of pain. He screamed, "No, Polly, please, no!" But Polly was relentless. She said, "Oh, hurry up, George. You don't want to miss your wedding again." And she dragged him into the church and up the aisle, step by inevitable step. George twisted and writhed and finally jerked his arm free. His arm was blackened and withered as if it had been scorched. There were red streaks emanating from it, coursing up and across his body so fast he could almost see them move. They were burning everything in their wake. George ran from the church, gasping for breath as the blackness encircled his throat. Polly's final words ringing in his ears. "See you soon, sweetheart." George's body was found the next morning under the spreading oak tree, a look of terror on his charred face. At long last, Polly had gotten her man. Make good relationship choices, people, because it might come back to haunt you if you don't.
This is my version of The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce, published in 1891. These mountains guard their secrets well. We may find some fading remnant, a arrowhead lost long ago, the battered boiler of a moonshine still, the initials of two long dead lovers carved into the side of an oak tree. But the instant these marks are made, the mountains begin to erase them. In time, These traces will vanish just as completely as the people who left them. In the most rugged section of these mountains lies the ruins of an old cabin. It is shrouded by dense forest, to the point that even the most vigilant hunter passing nearby might miss the cabin entirely. There is evidence of a sort of a long abandoned attempt to clear land for crops in front. Large decaying stumps are visible here and there, but the underbrush has long since reclaimed most of that ground. The cabin itself is a small one-room affair with a stone chimney on one side and a covered porch with an entry door across the front. The cedar shingles on the roof caved in long ago, surrendering to soaking rains and the frost of winter. The rear of the cabin is dominated by a large wooden frame that was once the cabin's only window. But that space has since been carefully covered over with heavy boards and is today the most well-preserved section of the entire cabin. Even now, not even the faintest glimmer of sunlight can pass through the boarded window. Was this cabin haunted? Perhaps. In the years before his death, the man who built this cabin was most certainly a haunted man. He looked 70, but could not have been more than 50 years old. His hair, his long, full beard were both solid white. His eyes were gray and lifeless and seemed to have sunken into his face. He was tall and thin and stood with the stooped shoulders of a man who had carried a heavy burden for a long, long time. His name was Murlock. He and his wife, Sarah, were among the early settlers in this area, and they arrived here young, strong, and full of hope. They did not build their cabin near the trading post or even near other settlers. Instead, they journeyed 2 days more till Murlock selected this patch of rugged forest ground where his only neighbors could be the creatures of the forest or a passing Cherokee. Don't like much people around, Murlock said. Makes me feel crowded. But for all his love of quiet and solitude, Murlock was deeply devoted to his young bride. Sarah was the one who shared the dangers and hardships of their life with a willing spirit and a light heart. She was his partner in every way. As Murlock set about building the cabin and clearing the land, Sarah worked by his side. She was no match for his physical strength, but Murlock knew that Sarah was his spirit and soul. No matter how discouraged or exhausted he became, he knew that in the evening there would come a time when the two of them would just sit quietly together. He would rest his head on her chest. She would stroke his hair, and all would come right once more. One day Murlock came home from a long hunting trip to find his wife lying on the cabin floor, delirious with fever. There was no doctor within miles, of course, or even a neighbor who might help. So Murlock set about nursing her back to health. But by the end of the third day, Sarah fell into unconsciousness and exhaled a long, rasping breath that Murlock felt certain was her last. He fetched the small mirror from her table and held it to her nostrils. No breath. He placed 2 fingers on the inside of her wrist. No pulse. And Murlock sat beside Sarah on the edge of their bed for a long time, with his face buried in his 2 big hands. When he was certain that she was dead, Murlock knew that the responsibility for preparing the body for burial must fall to him. He had vague recollections of his mother and aunts, preparing townspeople for burial. They kept a large laying out board to hold the cooling body, but Murlock supposed that his kitchen table could serve that same purpose. There were rituals to perform. He needed to pass a lighted candle the full length of the body 3 times. Or was it 5? And there was something about salt in a bowl. Murlock knew his efforts were but a crude imitation of the original task. But other duties came to him more readily, and Murlock performed those mechanically and without emotion. He washed and dressed the body. He bound her wrists and ankles with ribbon. He arranged her long, beautiful hair on each side of her face. Sometimes he would get distracted and repeat the same task over and over. In other cases, a task as simple as tying a bow seemed to require supernatural power. Murlock was astonished at these failures, much as a drunken man is startled by his sudden inability to walk. There were other rituals to perform, ones he needed to perform before it was too late. But his attempts to summon them brought only clouds and smoke. To clear his mind, Murlock threw open the rear window and breathed deeply of the wild lilacs that Sarah had loved. It was growing dark. He would need to light the lantern soon. Murlock was surprised and more than a little ashamed that he did not weep. For surely it was unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow I will build a coffin and dig the grave. And then I will miss her when she is no longer before my eyes. But for now, she's dead, of course, but everything will be all right. All will come right once more. For as Murlock's hands worked on, his consciousness maintained the belief that everything would be all right, that he would have Sarah back just as before and everything explained. Perhaps this was the dream, and tomorrow morning they would awaken together and they might have a laugh at the silliness of it all. For you see, Murlock had no experience with grief. His heart could not contain it all. His imagination could not rightly conceive of its power. For grief is a musician with unlimited range. It plays a funeral dirge on each individual, evoking sharp, shrill shrieks from some, low, rhythmic moans from others. To one, grief comes like a slice of a razor, sharp and stinging, rousing all the senses to a fever pitch. To another, grief falls like the blow of a blacksmith's hammer, leaving everything in its path crushed and gone. This last is how it was with Murlock. For no sooner did he finish his work than he sank into a chair beside the table where the body lay. He placed his arms on the table's edge and dropped his face onto them, unutterably weary. And at that moment, through the open window, came a long, wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child deep in the darkened woods. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, that unearthly cry fell upon him. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream. For Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, this unfaithful watcher awoke and lifted his head from his arms. He listened intently, but for what? There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, he recalled everything that had happened and without emotion. He strained his eyes to see anything. His senses were all alert. His breathing had stopped. Even his blood seemed to have ceased flowing to help create the silence. Who, what had awakened him? And where was it? Suddenly something shook the table beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or imagined he heard, a light, soft footstep. Then another. The sound of bare feet on the cabin floor. Had Sarah come back to him? How he longed to call out her name or simply reach out his arm and learn if she was still there. But he was terrified beyond the ability to cry out or to move. And so he waited. For what felt like a century, he waited. And then it happened. Some heavy body slammed the table into his chest, nearly knocking him down. And at the same instant, something fell to the floor with such a violent thump that it shook the entire cabin. A scuffling ensued and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. At last, Murlock rose to his feet. He flung his arms across the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror is overcome by madness, and that madness screams for action. With no motive beyond the impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, groping for his loaded rifle, and when he found it, he fired at once without aiming. And by the flash that lit the entire room for one vivid instant, he saw an enormous mountain lion dragging the dead woman toward the open window, its teeth fixed in her throat. And then darkness came, blacker than before, and silence. And when consciousness returned, the sun was high, and the woods were filled with the songs of birds. The body lay near the open window where the beast had dropped it, frightened by the flash and explosion of the rifle. Her clothing was in disarray, her long hair a tangle, her limbs arranged in an awkward sprawl. A fresh pool of blood had formed by her badly mangled throat. The ribbon with which he had bound her wrist was broken. Her hands were tightly clenched. And between her teeth, was a fragment of the animal's ear. Later that same day, Murlock boarded the window. These mountains guard their secrets well. In time, these traces will vanish just as completely as the people who left them. Thank you.
Can we hear it one more time for Andy? I'm going to wrap this up with one more, and something a little more personal this time. Pastor Wilkins was known for casting out demons. It all started with the imp that was plaguing Peggy Jean Calder, making her glue the teacher's grade book shut and tie Jenny Carter to her desk with her own shoestrings. Well, at Pastor Wilkins' prompting, Peggy Jean's mama brought her up to the altar rail, and then he cast the wickedness clean out of her. Do you know she's behaved ever since? Well, the next week, there was a whole line of parents dragging their youngins up. And the week after that, the grown-ups started bringing each other up there, too. Wives pulling their husbands forward, employees shoving their bosses to the front. And because Pastor Wilkins made public confession a central part of the casting out, well, us kids heard about all kinds of things that were usually only whispered. Church became a fascinating study in the darker side of human nature. The pews were packed every week. But with all that teaching and preaching and casting out, I don't suppose anybody put much thought into what would happen to a demon when it left the body. Most people probably thought they just went back on down to the underworld. But that's not what happened. No, instead those demons took up residence in the church. Maybe they were just as fascinated with the weekly parade of human sin as everyone else. All I know is that old church was haunted something terrible. Nobody dared go in the church building at night. And even if you were just brave enough to peek in the windows, you'd see the awfulest things that ever were. I know, because my cousin Marnie dared me to do it. It happened one Sunday after church. All the grown-ups were sitting around on the porch exchanging prayer concerns, otherwise known as gossip. And Marnie said to me, I bet you my new hair ribbon, you won't go look in the church windows tonight. You're too chicken. You'd never do it. Marnie was just 9 years old at the time, and I was a much more worldly 11. But she had my number. I had long since been afraid of things that go bump in the night. And for the past 3 weeks, I had been coveting her new purple hair ribbon. But I was never one to let common sense get in the way of the pursuit of fashion. So I said, oh yeah, I'll do it. And you're coming with me. We got permission for Marnie to sleep over, and then we snuck out late in the night. And we were the bravest kids you ever saw when we stepped foot off the porch, striding into the night in search of adventure. But when we turned off on the dirt road that led down to the church, and a cold fog slithered in, wrapping us in its tendrils, we both began to drag our feet. And then Marnie started voicing the reservation. She said, maybe this is not the right night to do this, with the weather being so changeable and all. And if your mama wakes up and we're not there, she's going to be awful worried. I think we ought to go back, don't you? Well, I was scared too, but there's no way I was going to admit it. So I said, I know what you're about. You're just afraid you're going to lose the bet. You don't have to give me that hair ribbon. Well, if you're too chicken, you sit right here and wait. I'm going on. Marnie sat down under the old oak tree at the edge of the church property. She wrapped her arms around her knees and shivered. I kept walking, regret in every step. When I got close to the church building, that fog embraced me, whispering an invitation to dark things I had no business knowing. I wanted to turn back, run to the warmth and safety of my mama's kitchen, but I found that I couldn't. Something compelled me to step forward, press my face to the church windows. The altar was ringed in wraith-like creatures, ghastly in their brokenness, their faces contorted with every human pain. And in the center of them all sat Pastor Wilkins, his face bathed in an unearthly orange light that was straight out of the depiction of hell in my illustrated Bible. He turned suddenly and winked at me. Then he ran his taloned fingers through his hair, unthreaded purple ribbon. And in that moment, I knew him for what he was, the devil. Pastor Wilkins hadn't been casting out demons. He'd been collecting them. I turned and ran straight back up the dirt road. I jerked Marnie to her feet. We ran all the way home. I started hollering as soon as we hit the front porch steps. I said, Mama, Mama, at the church, I saw him, Pastor Wilkins. He's the devil, Mama. He's the devil. And my mama came running to, and she said, what on earth are you girls doing out this time of night and carrying on with such wild tales? Pastor Wilkins may be strict, but he is not the devil. I ought to wash your mouth out. I tried and tried. She wouldn't believe me. But Marnie and I decided that this discovery was much too important to keep to ourselves. So the next day we went to see the church deacon and the treasurer and the head of the altar guild and every other grown-up we knew in the church. None of them believed us. It was like they were all in Pastor Wilkins' thrall because they all kept saying the same thing. What a devoted man of God he was, and how you could tell because he worked such long hours, never leaving the church building during the daylight hours. So finally, desperation, Marnie and I went to see the one person in our community who did not attend services, old Miss Hepzibah Jones. We'd never met her, but everybody knew who she was. She had famously left the church when Pastor Wilkins had first arrived, loudly proclaiming that she would never break bread with that man because they had theological differences. Miss Hepzibah was rumored to be so old, she was just 1 year younger than God. So ugly, she could sit on a tombstone and hatch a hate. And so mean that the devil himself would run from her. We were hoping that last part was true. Miss Hepzibah lived a few miles back in the woods, a little past the Johnson's pond. And we knew we'd found the right place when we saw the fairy dancers in the trees. Do y'all know what those are? They were long strings of tiny mirrors that twisted and twirled and caught the light. And there was a bottle tree in the yard, blue glass. See, Miss Hepzibah was a root woman, known to truck in remedies, religion, and magic. She was the kind of woman who could make a curse out of horsehair and cure warts with a psalm. We were so excited to meet her. We stepped up on the front porch and she opened the door before we even knocked. And then we looked up at her, momentarily taken aback. The rumors of her age and lack of physical beauty had not been exaggerated. But her voice was kindness itself. She said, "Well, hello, sugars. You look troubled. Come on in, sit down. Tell me all about it. Do tell. Do tell." So we sat down at her kitchen table and looked around at the bundles of herbs and the glass jars full of who knows what. And I told her that our local pastor was indeed the devil. And then a miracle occurred. She believed me. She said, "Oh, honey, I know. Now, what are we going to do about it?" Marnie and I snuck out again that night. We met Miss Hepzibah by the old oak tree at the edge of the church property. When I felt that cold fog slither in, I began to quake. But Miss Hepzibah pinched me on the arm hard. She said, "You hold fast to your courage, girl. You're going to need it." Marnie and Miss Hepzibah and I shuffled toward the church, and that was when I began to doubt the wisdom of putting all our faith in someone who looked so old that the wind might blow her to dust. But she pounded on the church door with a surprisingly strong hand. And then she called out in a clear voice, "Old Scratch, you come on out here. I want to make a deal with you." The church doors opened instantly, flooding the area where we stood with that hellish orange light. And the devil said, "Ah, Hepzibah, I knew you'd make your way to me eventually. Everyone does. And you brought 2 fresh young souls with you. How delicious." Looking down at Marnie and me like we were the dessert table at the church social, the devil and his demonic entourage took a big old step forward. And we took a big old step back. Then he said, "So, this deal." And the church door slammed shut behind him. Miss Hepzibah said, "Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking since you came to town. And I've read everything there is to read about you in the Bible and in the public library. And all these tales of your wondrous powers have got me to thinking about which side of things I ought to be on. But I'm one of those doubting Thomases, those people who have to see to believe. So I've come here tonight with 3 tasks. Now, if you can't do them, they're too much for you, we'll just go our separate ways as we have been. But if you can do all 3 and make me a believer, you can have my soul and the souls of these 2 youngins." Marnie and I gaped at her. That had not been part of the plan. I said, "But Miss Hep," and she said, "You shush, child. You'll do as you're told. Now don't crowd me so." Marnie and I stepped apart from her, having just been reminded to get on with our part of the plan. Y'all good so far? You ready for the deal with the devil? Excellent. Miss Hepzibah said to the devil, "You know, these 3 tasks, they'd be no trouble at all for somebody like Jesus, but I'm just not sure." And he said, "Anything that Jewish boy from Bethlehem can do, I can do better. What's the first task?" She said, "All right. Well, the good book says that Jesus' first miracle was turning water to wine at the wedding at Cana, right? He did it because his mama asked him to. Can you do the opposite? Can you turn wine into water?" The devil said, "Child's play." Miss Hepzibah pulled an old bottle from her cloak, poured several burgundy drops on the ground, and handed it to him. Then he took it, and ever the showman, raised it aloft for the assembled demons to see. And he whispered to it, coaxing the liquid in his serpent's tongue. And he turned it over, and what appeared to be pure, clear water came running out. But Miss Hepzibah was not one to leave anything to chance. She pulled a cup from her pocket and caught some to taste. The demons all pressed in around her, eager to see the evidence of their master's success. So Marnie and I took the opportunity to skirt around behind them. We positioned ourselves with our backs to theirs so that we were facing the church doors while everybody else was watching Miss Hepzibah. When we heard her announce that the devil had succeeded in the first task, we looked at each other, terrified. Our souls were now 1/3 of the way to hell. It was time to get busy. We began to dig in our pockets. The devil said to Miss Hepzibah, "Well, are you satisfied?" And she said, "No, that was really something. But I think I need to see just a little bit more." And he said, "Oh, what is it this time? Making the lame walk, the blind see, or perhaps something more personal, resurrecting the nearly dead?" He laughed coldly, and the demons laughed with him. But Miss Hepzibah was unruffled. She said, "No, I got something else in mind." He said, "Oh, get on with it." She said, "When Jesus was in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, he calmed a storm. Can you do the opposite? Can you make a storm rage?" He said, "Child's play." I told myself I wasn't going to look, but I couldn't help it. I peeked over my shoulder. I saw him raise his taloned fingers to the sky, call in the clouds. Then we all heard the rumble of thunder and a deafening crack as lightning struck the old oak tree, set it ablaze. Then he snapped his fingers, and all of us, except for him, were standing in a sudden downpour. Then the rain stopped. Marnie and I looked at each other. 2 tasks done. No time to lose. The devil said, "Seen enough." Miss Hepzibah said, "Yeah, you certainly got a bag of tricks. But I think I need to see just a little bit more." He said, "Oh, for hell's sake, Hepzibah, at least make it something interesting this time. You know, I've always heard you described as a woman of great intelligence, but I find myself extremely disappointed. These tasks have hardly been taxing. Do see if you can come up with something a little better this time." As the devil droned on and on about how bored he was, Marnie and I finished our task. We knew what was supposed to happen next, but we weren't at all sure it was going to work. So we clasped hands, said a prayer, and turned around to watch. Miss Hepzibah was putting on quite a show of things, looking for all the world as if she were struggling to come up with a new third task, something better than what she'd originally had in mind, something that would be up to the devil's exacting standards. Then she suddenly caught my eye. I nodded. She smiled as if she had just thought of the perfect thing. She said, I got it. When Jesus was dying on the cross, the sky went black. Day turned to night. Can you do the opposite? Can you turn night to day? You see where this is going? The devil said, "Watch me," and bowed down. Once more he raised his taloned fingers to the sky. This time he snuffed out the stars one by one, leaving us standing in absolute blackness. Then he drained that blackness from the sky. It seeped down into the ground at our feet, and he replaced it with the brilliant reds and golds of morning. Marnie and Miss Hepzibah and I made astonished sounds, egging him on. He kept going, increasing the intensity of the light until we were all standing under the brilliant, blazing noonday sun. The devil laughed and said to his demons, "Victory is ours, my friends! Prepare for the feast." The demons looked at us and snapped and snarled and sizzled. The devil was sizzling too, but so caught up in his own success, he had not yet realized what was happening. A creature of darkness and night, he could not withstand the full light day. That was why he never left church during the daylight hours. When what he had done dawned on him. I know, somebody. But when he had done dawned on him, he panicked and ran for the church doors. Marty and I stepped aside and let him. People say that if you hang a mirror by the front door to your house, the devil can never enter because he is so vain, he will get stuck there looking at himself. And that night, we saw that it was true. While Miss Hepzibah had kept the devil busy calling up a storm and turning night to day, Marnie and I had attached fairy dancers, those strings of tiny mirrors, to the church doors, so that the devil stood there transfixed, unable to look away from the dozens of reflections of his Pastor Wilkins facade, even as it withered and burned. In the end, all that was left were piles of ashes and a purple hair ribbon. I did not pick it up.